All right, so this week, or last week of lectures, I have two videos this week. One where I'm going to talk about monopoly and antitrust in social media generally, and in the second video, talk specifically about Amazon. Okay, so what do we got here? This is all the readings are fairly recent. Because of course it's a very recent subject. But I think these are things that you're going to see play out over the next decades. And so I'm trying to give you a preview of things to watch in your career in the creative sector as these things go forward. So one of the things we said last week was that, and Tim Wu brings this up, since the 1970s, antitrust law has mostly narrowed its concern to just looking at, does a merger harm consumers? Does it raise prices? Okay, and that has become sort of the thing to look at. So without consideration of any other aspects of monopoly power. Well, when you think of big internet companies like Google or Facebook, it kind of lets them off the hook because you think, well, all their stuff is free. I can use Google for free. I can use Facebook for free. So obviously anything they pick up isn't really affecting any prices of things we do. So if that's all antitrust law is going to look at, then with social media, probably everything is going to get approved because nothing is raising prices because we don't see prices there, okay? So it poses a difficult kind of problem. All right, so what have we got here? Well, one thing we have is a long New Yorker article on sort of proposals by Senator Elizabeth Warren. And you'll remember Elizabeth Warren was one of the candidates who vied to become the Democratic nominee for president in this past election. She did not succeed, but she still is senator from Massachusetts and still an influential person. But she has really taken this on. And so it's interesting to look at, well, what are her policy proposals with a Democrat in the White House, with Joe Biden just having won election. Will we see some proposals go forward? Will the Department of Justice be pursuing any of this? So what Senator Warren has been saying is, look, these monopolies have exacerbated income inequality, and they have stifled innovation that we might get from new businesses, okay? And that's something we talked about last week. She agrees that there is genuine value in what these big tech firms have created, okay? We use them all the time. But that we do need room for competition. So what are her proposals? What does she think actually needs to be done with these? Well, one is, she says, we've got a problem if you are both a participant in a marketplace and you are the marketplace. Okay, so the city of Bloomington has a farmer's market. So imagine if the city of Bloomington was running this farmer's market and the city actually was selling its own produce in competition with other independent farmers. They might see a problem with that because they might say, well, you know, the city is going to give its own vendors the best locations. They will take advantage of, you know, predatory pricing. You can imagine the potential for a lot of unfairness. But this is exactly what we've got. We've got Amazon creating brands like Basics. You know, you can buy clothing that's promoted by Amazon. Google has its own advertising and search engine as well as being a marketplace. And so one of her proposals is we really should split this up because it is a recipe for trouble if a firm is both the marketplace and one of the sellers. Second thing she suggests is that we should undo mergers, right? Amazon bought Whole Foods. It bought Zappos, the really good shoe store. Facebook buys Instagram. It bought WhatsApp. Google has bought a number of smaller apps. Waze, which was a navigation app. Nest, which was for smart home products. DoubleClick, an ad service. And so you get all these purchases, right? And that tends to make them fairly powerful. Now, one of the essays I put on the syllabus is by Franklin Foer, really good writer, and he is concerned about the political power of these big tech firms. And he gives some nice examples. I do encourage you to read him. He's a very good writer. It's not dry, unlike some of the other stuff we read. So do read Franklin Foer's essay. So he gives an example that I think is relevant. He gives the example of the telegraph. Okay. Now, in the 19th century, the late 19th century, Western Union, which is still a firm, they established itself as a monopoly on that vital technology. Okay. The telegraph was as vital as the internet is now. All right. Now, in the United Kingdom, they nationalized its telegraph system, integrating it into the post office, but the United States did not. Okay, and Western Union certainly didn't want that, right? They wanted to be an independent firm. Now, telegraphs were expensive. They were expensive to send, and only businesses could afford them. So they wanted to protect their position. So what did Western Union do? Well, it did a number of things, and almost amusing. They set themselves up in the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., and let elected officials use it for free. Okay, so you're buying political favors by saying, okay, we own this thing, we're going to charge businesses a lot, but we'll let members of Congress use it for free. Then, this was a really tricky thing. They joined forces with Associated Press. Associated Press is the big wire service. Again, it's a long-running firm. It still exists, okay, as a major news service. You can follow AP Wire Services on Twitter or whatever, which was also at the time a monopoly. Okay, because there were a lot of returns to scale and having reporters all over the place. Small newspapers kind of had to rely on Associated Press. They couldn't possibly afford to have reporters everywhere. So, and in fact, contracts that small newspapers would have is that if they signed a contract with Associated Press, the contracts would often say you have to use Associated Press and only use it. You can't use rivals, and you can never disparage Associated Press. So you cannot run a local newspaper, be under contract with Associated Press, and then write any unfavorable news about Associated Press. So what happened? Well, Ford tells the story that Western Union, the telegraph company, gave Associated Press exclusive use of its wires at a cheap rate. Okay, Western Union says to Associated Press, here, you can use our telegraph service at a cheap rate, and we will not let any competitors use it. Okay. AP agreed, but part of the deal was that they would never disparage Western Union. They would never write stories that were disparaging to Western Union. And if a newspaper disparaged Western Union, they would lose their ability to use Associated Press. Okay, so everything was linked. This all actually happened. They actually really did dump newspapers for writing unfavorable stories about Western Union because Associated Press didn't want to do that. So they, you know, this was a real conspiracy. And Ford says, you know, it's hard to believe that these things can actually happen, but they really did happen. Okay, they really did happen. And Ford's big point, and this is a really big point, is that knowledge monopolies are different because they will inhibit criticism of themselves. Okay, so we might not like it if, say, the oil refinery industry, as in the Rockefeller days, had a monopoly. It's bad because it gives, you know, very high prices, it limits innovation and competition, it gives them political power, it has all those bad things to do with it. But knowledge monopolies can be even worse because it has all those problems, plus they have the ability to stifle any criticisms of themselves. Okay, Ford even gives a personal story about how he wrote an unfavorable article about Amazon in the New Republic, and Amazon essentially took action against the New Republic. Authors really want to avoid criticizing Amazon. He might be overstating this, but it is tricky. He claims that the Washington Post is soft on Amazon because it has the same owner, Jeff Bezos. Okay, so he worries about these knowledge monopolies. We know that Facebook and Google target media messages. They have lots of political influence. So for example, and it can even be subtle. So suppose, well, you saw them in the last election cycle. Think about just up to the last election. You would often see ads out there that said, vote. Make sure you vote. Get out and vote, right? They think, well, that's obviously neutral. It's not telling you to vote Democrat or vote Republican. It's just saying, get out and vote. It's your civic duty. What could be, you know, what could be the harm in that? And Ford points out that, well, Facebook and Google and so on have the ability to target get out the vote messages to voters most likely to choose their favorite candidate, right? So if I just use sort of what seems like a very neutral get out the vote message, but I'm really pushing it to voters who I think would favor my candidate, then it is actually a political ad, right? And Google actually boasts about how President Obama back in the day successfully used Google Analytics. Okay, so you can see the problems here. Now, Wu notes that in the early days, in the early internet days, every tech company was sort of contestable and they came and went. I've actually added an article, I updated the syllabus just to add this one newspaper article because it was so good, from 2007, so 13 years ago. And it's in The Guardian, which is a very smart newspaper. And the title of the article is, "Will MySpace Ever Lose Its Monopoly?" Now, MySpace is not a social media site. I'm not even sure it exists anymore. I bet it's not one you use, but it was seen as all-powerful, something that could not be displaced. Now, at that time, Facebook was only 3 years old, barely existing, but of course, we know that MySpace, yeah, it did lose its monopoly. It lost it pretty fast. 2010 saw the launch of Instagram, which was a first real challenger. So in the early days of the internet, you did get a lot of new companies coming up, especially favoring the young. Okay, now you see things like, TikTok and various things like that. Well, that all seems good. It all seems fairly dynamic. We get all these new sites and everything like that. The problem is that the larger corporations buy the smaller ones. Okay, so Facebook bought Instagram, paid $1 billion for it, though estimates are it's now worth about $100 billion. It wasn't stopped, even though they were obvious competitors. I mean, Facebook bought Instagram because it was a competitor, because young people were leaving Facebook for Instagram, right? But again, if you have a Justice Department that just says, well, is this a thing where prices are going up? And you say, no, all these apps are free. What's the big deal? What's the problem? But both Wu and Four are saying, yeah, it is actually a problem. Then Facebook paid $19 billion for WhatsApp. Okay. In fact, they list 67 unchallenged acquisitions by Facebook. Google and Amazon are likewise doing a whole bunch of corporate purchases. So this is the problem. These were not coercive takeovers. These companies were happy to sell, right? Big prices, so nobody was making them do it. The problem is that you are really reducing competition. Okay, the biggest cheerleader for all this is the figure Peter Thiel. Okay, if you ever watch the movie The Social Network, you'll see he appears there. And he wrote a book called "Competition is for Losers." And you sort of think, okay, well, if that's the attitude, but that seems to be what's happening. So what does Tim Wu recommend? He recommends, first of all, that Congress has the right to review these mergers, and it should use it. And it should go beyond the simple question of whether a move might increase prices, because in social media, that rarely happens. So when you have Facebook acquiring another social media site, when you have Google acquiring another site like YouTube, they should actually look at it. And they should say, is this a real concentration of power? Is it going to restrict innovative firms? Is it going to restrict the flow of information? Congress has the power to do that. It should actually use it. Wu says, secondly, it should make these proceedings much more transparent. So if industry is filing, different briefings on what it wants, they should all be public. Any expert opinion should be made public. Wu also says they should pursue the big cases. They should force some breakups where you have big conglomerates. And of course, that's what Elizabeth Warren wants. And they should be more willing to just carry out analysis of the degree of competition in these sectors. Wu wants to protect true competition, okay? He wants competitive markets. He likes competitive markets. He'd be a great economist, but that's what he wants to see. Now, what are some of the problems that are going to come up here? Well, you have to worry. A thing that tech firms are doing is they've tried to make it difficult to break up because they internally merge, okay? So Facebook sets it up so that you can send WhatsApp messages through Facebook. Well, that makes them harder to split up, right? Because it makes them look more like one thing rather than two things. And so the more that companies become integrated with their products, the harder it is to break up. Apple is very much like that, right? Think of Apple sort of hardware, their phones and everything like that. Think of all the Apple apps. How do you actually break that up? How do you actually split that up? It's actually fairly difficult. The other big question that's sitting out there, and I have no idea what the answer for this is, but all these tech firms are sitting on all this data, right? We know that social media firms just have a mountain of data, and they are processing it all the time. If I search for something online, I now immediately get emails saying, oh, we noticed you were looking at button-down shirts. Would you like to look at these? There's just all this data sitting out there. If you break up these firms, where does that data go? Do all the firms hold it? And is that really the issue that we have? A couple of weeks ago, we talked about the problem of social media firms just simply gathering all this information on us. How does that work when we try to break up these companies? Maybe it'll even make things better. Okay, let me leave that there. And in the next talk, I will talk about Amazon.